The Missouri River, a 2,341-mile force, refused to be untamed. It unleashed ice jams and floods so vicious they wiped out entire settlements. In 1933, as the nation starved for hope, Franklin Roosevelt authorized what Congress never did, to build a dam of unimaginable scale, 250 feet high, 21,000 feet long, and more than 126 million cubic yards of earth, in a frozen, windswept nowhere. 50,000 desperate men and women descended for 50 cents an hour, braving winters so harsh the dipper would be frozen in the water pail and the mattresses were frozen to the wall. America gambled its biggest public works project on a wild prairie, driven by desperation executive fiat and the myth that nature could be conquered for good. But the consequences of that choice, and what really happened beneath the mud, would test every assumption about who wins when humans take on a river like this. The Missouri River does not bend to human will. For more than 2,000 miles it carves a restless path from the high country of western Montana to the Mississippi, swelling with spring melt, shrinking in drought and turning violent in winter. Early settlers called it the Big Muddy, a river that could rise without warning and freeze so hard that entire towns vanished overnight. In March 1877, an ice gorge formed just below the trading post at Fort Peck. The river jammed, water backed up, and when the ice finally gave way, it unleashed a wall of water that tore the fort's wooden walls to splinters. The flood erased every trace of the outpost, a warning written in mud and ice. Gauge records from the 19th century show the river's moods in sharp numbers. One year a trickle, the next a flood so high it swept away cattle, homes and railroad tracks. Out here, the land is so flat and exposed that the wind seems to have its own voice, and the river is never far from disaster. For those who tried to make a life along its banks, the Missouri offered no guarantees. Farmers watched their fields drown in spring, then crack and dust in July. Steamboat captains learned to fear hidden sandbars and sudden snows. Even the Army's engineers, sent to map and measure, recorded stories of ice jams that would lift a locomotive off its rails. Isolation was total. The nearest city was hundreds of miles away. The river's wildness was both a curse and a challenge, a force that demanded respect, but also tempted dreamers to imagine what might be possible if it could be controlled. The Missouri was not just a barrier, it was a problem that refused to go away. And as each new disaster struck, the voices calling for a solution grew louder, setting the stage for a struggle between nature's power and human ambition. On October 15, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt made a decision that stunned even his closest advisors. Without a single line of new congressional authorization, he signed an executive order launching Fort Peck Dam as Federal Project No. 30. The paperwork cited emergency powers and the desperate need for jobs, but the real story was speed. Faster than the law, faster than the river itself. The Public Works Administration reprogrammed funds overnight, bypassing the usual debates, hearings and reviews. There was no environmental study, no tribal consultation, no formal cost-benefit analysis. All that mattered was momentum. Senator Burton K. Wheeler, Montana's political heavyweight, had lobbied the White House relentlessly. He brought petitions from Valley County, telegrams from farm bureaus, and a promise that the people of northeastern Montana would stand behind the project. In the 1934 local election, the numbers told the story: 83% voted yes to 17% no. Wheeler waved those returns in front of Roosevelt's advisors, arguing that the High Plains were ready to trade their isolation for a shot at progress, and for relief from the river's violence. With the stroke of a pen, millions of acres of public land were withdrawn for dam construction. The Army Corps of Engineers was handed the keys, and within days, surveyors and labourers began arriving on the empty prairie. No one waited for congressional debate. Roosevelt's orders, Executive Order 6491, then 6707, then 7331, gave the project its legal armour. Critics in Congress fumed about overreach and fiscal recklessness, but the machinery of the New Deal was already grinding forward. In the middle of nowhere, the largest dam in America was about to rise, fueled by presidential will and the promise of work at 50 cents an hour. Earth-moving machines arrived before most people could even find Fort Peck on a map. Army Corps engineers set out to build what had never been built before, a hydraulic-filled dam stretching 21,026 feet across the Missouri, rising 250.5 feet above the prairie, and swallowing more than 126 million cubic yards of earth. The numbers alone stagger the imagination. 4 steel dredges clawed at the riverbed, slurping up mud, sand and gravel, then pumping the slurry through a latticework of pipes that snaked for miles across the site. At the heart of this operation, the so-called Fort Peck Navy, over 260 steel-hulled vessels shuttled endlessly between dredge and fill, keeping the dam's mountain of mud rising at a pace of nearly 8 feet per day during the busiest months. Engineers designed 4 diversion tunnels, each 25 feet wide, to steer the Missouri around the construction zone. Each tunnel was lined with steel and sunk deep into bedrock. Temporary railroads, over 60 miles of track, ferried equipment and men across the empty grassland. The spillway alone demanded 560,000 cubic yards of concrete and 55 million pounds of steel. Power lines stretched 280 miles from Great Falls to keep the lights burning through winter's deep freeze. The American Society of Civil Engineers called Fort Peck the most ambitious hydraulic fill dam ever attempted. Every statistic, every blueprint seemed to dare nature to answer back. But beneath the triumph, engineers could not ignore the uneasy truth. Building a mountain from mud meant trusting it would stand. At the height of construction, more than 10,500 men clocked in each morning, their breath clouding the air as they lined up for 50 cents an hour. Over the course of 5 years, more than 50,000 workers would cycle through these windswept camps drawn by the promise of a steady wage and a chance to outlast the Depression. 18 boom towns sprang up from the dust, places with names like Wheeler, Square Deal, New Deal, and Delano Heights. Most were little more than tar paper shacks and canvas tents, hammered together on frozen ground. Families arrived by train, wagon, or on foot, chasing rumours of work. Ivy Stapleton remembered nights so cold that the dipper would be frozen in the water pail and the mattresses were frozen to the wall. Her words, echoed in oral histories, capture the raw edge of survival on the prairie. Social life orbited around bars, mess halls, and the rare comfort of a hot meal. In Wheeler, Ruby's Buckhorn Bar became legend, a place where music and laughter briefly drowned out the grind of shovels and dredges. Danger was constant. Accidents claimed dozens of lives, and by the end, at least 60 men had died building Fort Peck. Yet the scale of the project and the hardship endured began to take on a mythic quality. When Margaret Burke White arrived with her camera, she called the place so primitive and so wild that the whole ramshackle town seemed to carry the flavour of the boisterous gold rush days. Her photograph of the rising dam graced the cover of the very first issue of Life magazine on November 23rd, 1936. Transforming the muddy labour of the Missouri into a symbol of national resolve, the faces in those images, stoic, wind-burned, proud, became the human measure of what it meant to build a mountain from mud. September 22nd, 1938, began as another day in the shadow of the dam. By early afternoon, a faint tremor ran through the upstream slope. Nothing at first, just a subtle shift beneath the slurry pipelines. Minutes later, the ground heaved. Without warning, a section of embankment nearly 1,700 feet long began to slide. More than 5 million cubic feet of earth and water surged forward, swallowing equipment, rail lines, and everything in its path. Workers sprinted for safety, but some had no chance. 8 men were killed, 34 injured, and 6 bodies vanished into the mountain of mud, never to be recovered. The forensic board traced the disaster to the unseen world below, layers of weathered shale and bentonite saturated and weakened by the relentless hydraulic fill above. The weight and water pressure had overwhelmed the foundation, triggering a rotational slip, a kind of slow-motion avalanche that left a ragged scar across the dam's face. The Army Corps of Engineers halted construction and rewrote their standards almost overnight. New protocols for geotechnical monitoring, piezometers, slope analysis, and stricter soil testing became the rule for every major dam that followed. Fort Peck Slide was a lesson written in mud and loss, a warning that even the most ambitious designs can fail when the ground itself gives way. Fort Peck. Lake runs 134 miles. Its shoreline twists through lost towns and treaty lands now buried underwater. Beneath the surface lie 18,000 acres of vanished farmland and the unmarked graves of men who never left the dam's shadow. In 2011, the dam released 66,000 cubic feet per second, more than any flood on record, pushing the old spillway to its limits and forcing emergency warnings downstream. The illusion of control faded as the river pressed back. Today, the Army Corps of Engineers faces a $225 million bill for repairs, including seepage control, crest raising, and turbine upgrades, yet less than 1/5 of that is funded. Seismic studies warn that tremors, possibly from fracking just 2.5 hours away, could unsettle the ancient shale beneath, echoing the disaster of 1938. A breach here would threaten Garrison and Oahe downstream, risking a chain reaction. 6 men remain entombed in the dam, silent witnesses to unfinished business. 80 years later, Fort Peck's wall that stretches 21,026 feet still holds back the Missouri, a river that knows patience. 6 men remain entombed, and hydraulic fill is now forbidden for high dams. The question lingers. What happens when physics, memory, and water outlast the ambitions that built a mountain from mud?